Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this morning. Today, we're going to have a presentation and discussion with Miss Joanna Octavia, a research fellow at CSIS Indonesia. Ms. Joanna Octavia is a public policy professional with over 8 years of experience in government affairs, policy research, and multisectoral stakeholder engagement. She is currently pursuing her PhD at the Warwick Institute for Employment Research in Coventry, United Kingdom. Her research primarily focuses on ICT4D and worker voice in the informal sector of developing countries. Prior to starting her PhD, Ms. Joanna was a senior public policy associate at Uber in Indonesia, and she had also worked as a senior researcher at the Center for Public Policy Transformation in Indonesia, a financial product analyst at Bloomberg LP Singapore, and a policy research intern at the Serco Institute, United Kingdom. Ms. Joanna graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2010 with an MSc in Comparative Politics, and from the University of British Columbia in 2009 with a BA in Economics and Political Science. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Ms. Joanna.
Hi, thanks so much, Indira, for the kind introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Joanna Octavia. I'm currently a fellow at CSIS Indonesia and also a doctoral researcher, PhD candidate at the Warwick Institute for Employment Research. Today, I'll be presenting about my preliminary findings from the fieldwork that I've been doing in Jakarta, Indonesia. The title of the presentation is From the Streets to the State, Mobilization of Online Motorcycle Taxi Drivers in Indonesia. To start with, I would like to outline a brief overview of the content I'll be covering today. I'll start by giving some background of the study that I'm doing, discussing a little bit of the definition of informality that we'll be using in this presentation, and also just some background on organization, mobilization of informal workers, especially in developing countries. And then I will go on to introducing the case study, talking a little bit about the evolution of motorcycle taxis in Indonesia, and outlining the research questions and method. Afterwards, I will go directly into the preliminary findings, and then I will close with the conclusion. Because this is still an ongoing research, parts of it may not be completely finished yet. And I do look forward to gaining your insights from this presentation, because I do acknowledge that and realize that there are a lot of experts in various fields here, and your insights and feedback would be very greatly appreciated. So to start with, there are two main types of informal workers. According to WIGO, which is an NGO supporting informal workers worldwide, one is contract workers who are salaried by an employer, and the two is self-employment or own account workers. These also include sometimes workers who own their own enterprise, but are not formally registered. These definitions are consistent with the definitions provided by the ILO, that also emphasizes the inclusion of single individuals working on an own account as self-employed persons. And this self-employment is something that we'll be going back to, as this is the category that the case study online motorcycle taxi drivers fall into. Although these are two different types, the common thread binding them is the fact that there are no formal working arrangements for the employees. As a global overview, in 2020, over 2 billion workers are earning their livelihoods informally, according to ILO. So that's a very sizable proportion of the global workforce. Informality in Indonesia, an overview, they do dominate the workforce. According to data, it's about 55% or more of the workforce. Informal workers are spread across sectors and occupations. You can find them in various sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, domestic work, and transport work, obviously, in urban spaces. They also access work in various ways. So some of them could be contract workers salaried by one employer. Some could also just come in and work for a day and get their day income. Some could also access work through platforms or an agency. An example of that would be online motorcycle taxi drivers. They're also heterogeneous because they are unregulated. There is relatively low barriers to entry. Not all informal workers are poor, and not everyone who's poor work in the informal sector, although in developing countries there is often a correlation between the two. In terms of regulatory context, informal workers are not covered by the national labor legislation. So in Indonesia, that would be the Law on Manpower, number 13 of 2003. They don't cover informal workers, including own account workers and workers with no formal working arrangements. The government has, have launched special initiatives to support them and trying to include them in the protection system. Both the Social Security for Workers Welfare and Health, BPJS Kesehatan dan BPJS Ketenagakerjaan, have launched these special schemes for non-employees in 2014, which informal workers may sign up and pay for independently. But coverage, I believe, remains quite low. Only about 4 to 5 million people out of 70 million informal workers are currently covered by at least by the BPJS Ketenagakerjaan scheme. There have been efforts by various organizations to organize and mobilize informal workers to demand for better working conditions worldwide. And I think for the benefit of this presentation, it would be beneficial to just distinguish between the two. Organizing in this presentation is defined as self-identifying as part of the community. It's like I'm part of this group. Whereas mobilizing, it just means activating an existing base of support, rallying people to do a collective action, which in this presentation is defined as a one-time occurrence, for example, a protest, a strike, a petition, etc. Uh, for this for this research, I focus mostly on protests. But collective action, of course, it could take on it another way as well. It could also be a process, which we will eventually see through the findings in this presentation. So these are just some logos of the various organizations that have assisted informal workers. You have WIGO, which I cited in the one of the first slides. They are an activist network that supports various types of women in informal employment worldwide, ranging from street vendors to domestic workers. And of course, for the Indonesia specific ones, you have the logos on the right-hand side. Jala PRT, for example, is an organization that supports domestic workers in Indonesia, supporting them in demanding for national legislation as well as for the government of Indonesia to sign on the ILO Convention for Domestic Work. Some examples of collective action worldwide. So earlier we talked about Jala PRT in Indonesia. This picture is a rally from India. So SEWA, which the logo is in the previous slide, the Self-Employed Women Association in India. It's currently the largest organization for informal workers worldwide. I believe the members are about 1.6 or so million people. Together with other central trade unions in India, they have been for many years mobilized millions of workers into protest demanding for better working conditions. Existing research have shown that these successful attempts at collective action in the sense of protests have rarely happened without the support of external actors like NGOs or unions. And that is a question, that this is something that will be addressed in this presentation. Have informal workers in Indonesia been able to attempt at successful collective action without or with little support from external actors? Have they been successful in organizing and mobilizing among themselves? To answer that question, I will go straight into the case study that I am developing on online motorcycle taxi drivers in Indonesia. So first, I'll talk a bit about the evolution of motorcycle taxis. Motorcycle taxis actually have been around in Indonesia for many years. They emerged in the 1980s in urban areas with the high penetration of motorcycles across the country. I think one very notable characteristic about motorcycle taxis is the concept of pangkalan or base camps. So every few hundred meters, if you walk in urban, like crowded urban areas in Jakarta, for example, you'll see a group of drivers with their motorcycles just hanging out in front of street street corners or in front of shops. Sometimes they would have a sign, Pangkalan Ojek, which signifies that this is a place where you go to get an ojek ride. In the past, there were no official fares or meters, so the way you get an ojek would be just to walk straight to them and tell them where you're going and bargain and haggle for a price. I remember in high school, I used to do that, and it would be like, it feels so good to be able to agree on a price finally. But because there are no official fares, meters, there are also no standards of service. You never know the price that you'll be getting. You never know what kind of driver you'll be getting, what kind of motorcycle you'll be getting. It's just very inconsistent and it depends on your luck that day. But at the same time, we have to give credit to motorcycle taxis because they are a significant gateway for urban employment. Past research by several of the ride-hailing companies have noted that a lot of the um, drivers that are driving on their system are economic or other types of migrants from other parts of Indonesia. So it is one of the ways to absorb unemployment in urban areas. And as time goes by and technology becomes better and better, and you have these smartphones, innovations came as well. So I believe like everyone has been familiar with Gojek, which is one of the major ride-hailing companies here in Indonesia. They started out as a call center in 2011. If you want to take a look on the picture on the right hand side, it's Telpon Kita. Call us at this number. They used to be a call center, so I remember just one day in 2012, 2013, I was very panicking because I need to deliver a package quickly, but I was just stuck in traffic in a car. And Gojek was a real lifesaver at the time. So I think, and this eventually grew into an app, which they launched in 2014, similar to call centers, but the difference is that with an app, you can just seamlessly request a ride or request a service, be it delivery of food or packages more quickly and more efficiently. And of course, with demand and good business comes competition. We have several regional competitors coming into the country right after Gojek launched its app. So Grab, a regional competitor, which originally came from Malaysia and now based in Singapore, I believe, they launched their bike services in Indonesia in 2015, followed by Uber Motor in 2016. I think we should also note that Uber had left Indonesia in 2018. So right now, the two main competitors are Gojek and Grab, with the emergence of several other smaller ones. We talked a lot earlier about base camps and how every few hundred meters you would see a group of drivers just hanging out, having coffee, catching up, and waiting for passengers or waiting for orders to come in through their app nowadays. But have you actually seen them all in one place together? So this is a picture taken from one of the protests that happened in 2018, one of the largest protests that have ever happened with drivers coming across Indonesia. I'll be highlighting a bit more about this protest later on. But yes, so, motorcycle taxis used to be a very informal sort of type of work has now, grown into the social networks, and they've even been able to band together and gather in one place, demanding for legislation and better working conditions. And the research questions that I will attempt to answer through this research and also this presentation is, how do informal workers, in this case, the drivers, organize and mobilize for collective action, as you have seen in the previous slide. And as I did this research, the questions eventually evolved into, how has this mechanism changed the nature of collective action in the informal sector? Has collective action changed its meaning in the informal sector, especially for motorcycle taxis? This is some of the questions that I'll attempt to answer in the next few slides. For the research method that I'm using, I combine a few methods actually. So first is literature review. I reviewed existing research. Most of the research on platform work is in the developed countries, and hence I thought it would be an exciting research as well to try to investigate this phenomenon in a developing country such as Indonesia. For lit review, I look at past research. I also look at a lot of policy papers and also news reports. For field work, which I conducted in Indonesia, and also I had the opportunity to do a fellowship with CSIS. Thank you so much for everyone at CSIS for having me. During this field work, I conducted a few research methods. The first is digital ethnography, because part of my research is also attempting to understand how the workers organize and mobilize in online spaces. But other than those, I also interviewed drivers and stakeholders. I think the numbers are close to 45 to 50 people that I've interviewed so far. Document analysis. So I analyzed a range of documentary evidence from reports about fare cuts to just photos and videos that are shared by the stakeholders. And also, a lot of the insights that I've been getting, a lot of contacts are actually from informal chats, not just from drivers and stakeholders themselves, but also experts that I've met along the way. To analyze the data, I use a grounded theory methodology. It's a purely qualitative research. Grounded theory methodology is characterized by two characteristics. The first is the constant comparative method, which means that I continuously cycle back and forth from data to theory, theory to data, data to theory. A key feature of grounded theory is to let the data speak for itself. And to refer back to the data as I collect more and more new data in developing and constructing a theory from this research. Another feature of grounded theory is the theoretical sampling, which basically means that I let the data guide my way. So after I collect, a number of data, I let the leads or the findings to determine what kind of data I will be collecting next. So yeah, those are two characteristics of the theory methodology, and that's what I'm using to analyze this study. Just going straight into the preliminary findings, there are a few things that I found or noticed as I conducted my research. The first is organizational structure of online motorcycle taxi drivers in Jakarta, or mostly Jakarta, but rest of Indonesia as well. I think there has been a lot of good research done around this. Some describe it as mutual aid organization where people help each other. I think that's a very apt way of describing their organization. So I think one key characteristic of the day-to-day organization is the physical base camps. It's basically similar to how it has always been in the past. The difference is that I think there are more of them now because of the number of drivers have been increasing. And sometimes these base camps, most of the time, they also have online community groups on both Facebook and WhatsApp. So on the right-hand side there, you see a screenshot of just a group, just a list of groups of drivers that I've kind of like took from Facebook. But other than Facebook, they also congregate mostly on WhatsApp due to the nature of their work and their access to smartphones. Online community groups have many types. So there are Basecamp specific groups. There are also something called WADA, which is basically a combination of members from different communities in one WhatsApp group. It gives them a lot more exposure to what's happening in their city most of the time, and also helps the members to coordinate among each other if there are, if person A needs to do something in the location where person B is at. So it helps with like coordination when they're not like closely together. Another type of community group is something called Lintas, which is basically a community group of drivers from all across Indonesia. And you can use this group to communicate with drivers who are living in a different city or in a different island. It helps them build this social network and a connection, an inbuilt connection when they happen to visit that city or that town. I think one very interesting feature that I found also was Unit Reaksi Cepat (URC), which some of the communities have. It's a division within the community that helps assist other drivers who get into accidents, not just helping other drivers, but also ordinary citizens. Sometimes they also help to assist ambulances to beat through the traffic and reach the hospital more quickly. Yeah, so these are some of the day-to-day organizations that I found and noted among these drivers that I've been speaking to. Yeah, but even though they have a social network, a very strong community amongst themselves, as time goes by, they were also growing this content between them and the platform they were driving with. Although they have friends within the industry, they are a few things that uh, uh, became there were a few difficulties that became apparent over time. The first, as we talked earlier about how uh, sorry, was just a bit distracted. Yeah, we talked earlier about how there were competitors in the industry. We had three at the time. We had Gojek, Grab, and Uber. Everyone wanted to get more market share, and as such, the fares kept decreasing. Good for riders, not so good for the drivers. And I think this feeling of discontentment also uh, kind of grew into a perceived injustice. Uh, One is that I think it can be very, driving is a very isolating job, right? Because other than hanging out with your friends at the base camp, you're basically driving by yourself across town to deliver things, to take someone to their next destination, etc. And to have all these like changes in fares and incentives being delivered to you through an app by a faceless person, sometimes it could feel unjust. How come you call me as a partner, but you're not even consulting me? I don't even have a say over these changes. And as such, because of this brewing and growing discontentment, protests against the platform started in 2015. And who actually coordinated these protests, right? Of course, in addition to the smaller communities, larger communities that are more focused on regulatory issues began to emerge during this time. They are mostly they've been around for quite a few years, but it is only recently that they've started registering themselves to have a legal status. Sometimes they are registered as perkumpulan, sometimes they're a co-op, a kooperasi, or sometimes they're a union, a serikat. There's no uniform entity that they adopt. Each of them just pick a legal status that they feel most comfortable with or they've been advised to pursue. Within these regulatory groups, they have different divisions, and I find this very fascinating. They have cooperatives even within the groups, co-ops that help drivers to start a business and also to grow and promote their business. They also have philanthropy initiatives. So sometimes when I'm arranging interviews with the drivers that I'm interviewing, they would say, "Oh, but can we do this like in a few hours? I'm fundraising," and I would be like so curious, like, "What are you fundraising for?" And turns out that they have these philanthropy initiatives that in which they fundraise to help various causes, be it from natural disaster victims to just other driver friends who are experiencing economic problems, for example, losing their house or having a child who is sick. So you can see like this mutual aid coordination exists not only on a day-to-day basis, but also on a much larger scale. And then the last thing is also advocacy partnerships. Some of them are very savvy in legal affairs. They do have partnerships, be it formal or informal, with NGOs who assist them with, studying the regulation and identifying just bits and pieces that they need to, study further or bring to the government's attention. Um, This is another picture of the protest that you have seen earlier. This was the Presidential Palace protest, which happened on 27th March 2018. This was not the first government targeted protest, but it was, in my opinion, one of the most important ones, because this was the protest that kickstarted the discussion that drivers need to have a regulation. I also found this protest very important, because it was also the first time drivers set up an alliance among themselves. So different community groups sent their representatives or their heads to work together and coordinate this large protest. Estimated attendance vary. They range from 7,000 to 120,000 drivers from all over Indonesia. But from what I know, they covered the streets from the Ministry of Transport all the way to the National Palace, to the Presidential Palace. So it's quite a substantial sized protest. Another thing that stood out is that while they did receive some assistance from NGOs to formulate the demands that they brought to the government, it was mostly driver-led coordination and action. I asked some of the drivers, like, did you have other stakeholders helping you, for example, like unions? They said, no, this is purely a driver-led action, and I thought that was quite something. And this protest ended with representatives being received by the Ministry of Transportation and President Jokowi. This was also the time during which they informed the president that the fares have been going lower and lower. And as I mentioned before, this is also the protest that kickstarted the discussion of the need for regulation for these drivers. After talking to many drivers and asking them, how do you mobilize, how do you organize and mobilize for protest, this is kind of a flowchart that I came up with. So normally they would coordinate among the leadership about a planned protest. They would talk about the logistics, like where to gather, where to meet, uh, which date would be suitable, which communities they would engage, which target they will be targeting. And once these details have been set in place, it was only then that they disseminate the information through many ways. But one of the more important channels, which I also look at in my research, is online communities. This information were spread from WhatsApp group and Facebook group one to another. I think it's also worth mentioning that drivers are members of multiple groups, especially on WhatsApp. One driver even told me that he has 100 groups on one phone. So it makes it very easy for them to just forward information from one group to the other. They also share information about upcoming protests through face-to-face interactions and also at meetings and gatherings, although these are not as widely used as online communities. And once the information have been disseminated, you get a sort of agreement from various base camps and also communities that they will participate in the protest. You turn up during the protest, the collective action. You march to wherever you're targeting, be it the palace or parliament. And during the action, normally the leadership would also bring letters or statements of their demands, which they then will hand over to the stakeholders when they are invited in, or when the stakeholders, when the policymakers come out to greet them or meet them at the venue. So most of the mobilizations, especially those targeting the government, have this flow. Um, yeah, and also I came up with a timeline because the purpose of this research is also to look at the different types of protests that have happened that targets the government. Um, Before 2017, there has been 50 plus protests against platforms, according to research by Nastiti, um, in various cities across Indonesia. And there is no less than, this is about 7 protests that target the government starting in 2017. So earlier we talked about the one in 27th March, the Presidential Palace protest. It was followed by the House of Parliament protest a month after. which gave birth to what they call as Team 10. That's a group of drivers who were selected to represent the driver groups in negotiating terms and conditions for the regulation. There are other protests as well, but I want to bring your attention to 2019, which was election year. And this timing, I believe, also played a part, although maybe not fully, to how to the different actors that became involved in this labor movement, and also the different interests that you may be getting from them. In 2019, the regulation was issued in the month of March, along with the decree, which outlined the list of minimum fares for the different zones in Indonesia. Most of these mobilizations demanded similar things. They demanded minimum fares. They also sometimes they would ask for a legal umbrella, which basically refers to the revision of the transport law, and also a clarification on what constitutes a partnership between them and the platform companies. What kind of rights do they get as a partner? In the aftermath of these series of mobilization, there are a few changes that I've sort of seen in the way the drivers interact with government and the public. The first is that they got a seat at the negotiating table. They're invited to FGDs. They're invited to seminars. Of course, it would be hard to say like whether or not that has impact on the outcomes that they wish for, but at least what we can see is that they are getting a seat at the negotiating table as a stakeholder who is recognized by the state. There's also regulatory change. So earlier we talked about how in 2019 the ministerial regulation governing motorcycle taxi industry was issued, covering aspects such as fair, safety, and also clarifying that the relationship between the drivers and the platforms are that of a partnership. But what that partnership constitutes remains to be evaluated. It's not mentioned in the regulation. There's also international recognition. So earlier this year, uh, you had one of the driver groups being invited to join a new global network of app-based drivers. The conference was in London. So there is some sort of this international network being set up and support that they're getting from their international partners. Some of the key findings is that first of all, organization is not always intended for mobilization. So social network has always been a key feature of the informal sector. Literature has shown us that people help each other in the informal sector. They see each other as family most of the time, especially if they have similar occupations. And some of these, and sometimes they also get job referrals from people in their social networks. So other than coming together to demand regulation, drivers do enjoy hanging out with each other as friends, and that is what most of these groups are for. For example, you can see here in the first quote, I always emphasize to friends, share your location for 8 hours. He's referring to driver friends who drive late at night. If one day anything happens to you, we can keep an eye out. So like what we talked about earlier, mutual aid, they look out for each other, they keep each other safe because they're all, they're what each other has. Another, platform company executive also says that the groups give them a sense of belonging, sense of self-worth, basic social cohesion. Driving, as mentioned before, is a very isolating job, and having this social, they don't, driving is not like coming to the office, right? Where you have colleagues, you have friends. You can, well, we used to be able to hang out in hallways or we have coffee together. There's that sense of togetherness, but driving is not like that. And having the social network gives them a sense of community. But of course, as mentioned here in the quote, it also functions as a way to organize. A driver aptly put as well that all groups are created for different reasons, and there's no reason to assume that organization is always intended for mobilization, always intended for protest. Sometimes they're just having fun hanging out with each other. I also got a sense that there are significant costs that was perceived by the drivers of participating in a protest. For a lot of drivers, if not all, the ones that I've spoken to, protests were viewed as a last resort. Right? It's when discussions are not going through, when other ways of mobilization are not responded to, then they do protest. But there is a perception among drivers that there are dire consequences for participating in mass mobilizations. I divide the cost into two. So first you have economic costs and then you have reputational costs. In terms of economic costs, drivers perceive that when platforms find out that they are protesting, the partnership will be terminated. And this is a very jarring fact for drivers because for many of them, the access to the platform is the only source of livelihood they have. So it's taking too much risk, according to them. And also the nature of platform work means that your income is dependent on how many orders you're taking in. And if you take, like, let's say 2, 3 hours off, not driving, to attend a protest, that means you're foregoing 2 or 3 hours worth of orders that might come in and income that might come in. I put this quote by a union just for comparison. So a union representative told me that, if the drivers attend a protest with the union, unions will help with advocacy if drivers get into problem. But because of the legal entities that was set up, perkumpulan or kooperasi, when drivers attend protests, they're kind of on their own if there are consequences resulting from their participation. The second cost is reputational cost. A driver told me that it looked like motorcycle taxis, online motorcycle taxis were thuggish if they attend protests all the time, right? Because it seems like we were always protesting about every little thing, and this might not be the best way to garner public or government support. Uh, Also, as you see from the mobilization timeline earlier, there has been a shift from mass mobilization to legal mobilization. The nature of collective action among the drivers have evolved, no longer just counting on street protests, but they also participate in policy dialogue and advocacy. And for some of them, they also have built a significant media presence. There are two reasons, according to them. The first is continuity. According to some of the drivers, what's important for protest attendance and momentum is that there must be a climatic policy. There must be a policy that makes most of the drivers very, very angry or upset, that they're willing to forego the costs that they were considering before and just go down to the streets and protest, right? And to ensure continuity, to ensure that the movement is ongoing, you do have sort of to not just count on protests as a way to mobilize. You also have to count on other things such as legal mobilization and engaging with the government and other stakeholders. The second is also a conscious effort. It seems that from the driver point of view, it seems that the government would prefer to engage them if they have a legal entity, if they are legally recognized. A driver protester told me that we start to realize that we need to set up a legal organization that are considered by the government so that future struggles will be easier, and at the very least the government will sit with us. And this is sort of corroborated by the government representative I interviewed, who said that actually everything can eventually be resolved at the negotiating table, right? Protests are not always necessary. We also need to consider stability. Yeah, and I think it is very apparent that leadership was a key component, the key driver of mobilization efforts, both for the street protests as well as the legal mobilization. I think one thing that stood out from platform work like Gojek, Grab, and Uber is that it has very low barriers to entry. I think for some apps like Uber, you can just sign up online. You don't even have to go to the office to sign up. It's just so easy to get an account back then. It has low barriers to entry. It has flexibility. You can switch it on and off anytime you want. And initially, it paid, it you get a really attractive sum of income. You could earn as much as 10 million per month, for example. And as such, it attracted a different set of people. It contributed also to the increasing diversity of the sector. Most of the driver protesters that I talked to, especially the leaders, they are 40, 50-year old. They're male. They are relatively well educated. And I think one thing that stood out also was some of them were previously, they have a history of activism. They know what they're doing. They know how to do these things. Um, I think if you take a look at the quote at the very bottom here, a driver protester told me that, some of us are friends who have more skills or capabilities than other drivers. For example, there are those who are lawyers. As for me, I'm more concerned with the economy. And then there are others who are more concerned with the movement. So I think here he's highlighting the different skills and skill sets that the drivers have and can contribute to the movement. But with the increasing heterogeneity and just the more educated group of leadership, it also raises questions over how representative they are over workers in the industry. To what extent can the diversity or heterogeneity of the informal sector be represented by their small group, right? A driver protester who is also a member of a regulatory association told me that, if you ask us how many members we have less than 100 people. If we have many members but they're not smart, that will be difficult too. So there is this emphasis on just wanting to attract the more well-educated leaders to conduct negotiations with the government and the platform. But it's also viewed by some driver groups as not representative. A driver told me that, in my view, the policy discussions were good, but I think they're not representative, especially since the people who are representing are not the fighter type. Also, they don't have mass. They don't have, they don't have grassroots strength. So who are they representing? So you can see here that there starts to be cracks and distrust and tensions between the driver groups themselves. And this leads to my next point, which is fractured movement. There are tensions between driver groups and also other actors in the labor activist network. Earlier, we talked about how there is like a growing distrust between the driver groups themselves, and that point is supported by some of the findings that I also found here. For example, a driver told me that, sometimes we don't know who in our group is on the side of the platform company management, close to the management, or even paid by the management to find information. In addition to tensions between the driver groups themselves, there are also tensions with other actors. Here, I highlight a bit about I think one of the traditional actors in the labor activist network are the unions, right? There are attempts by unions worldwide to engage informal workers due to low, gradually decreasing union penetration in many countries, including developed countries. There are tensions between driver groups and unions representatives in Indonesia. For example, here I think this ties in also with the timing of election in 2019, which resulted in a lot of just actors being interested in engaging driver groups. The driver protester said that if the union's interests are pure, then they are only looking to synergize with us, then I don't see a problem with it. But if they only want to use us because of our numbers, and then it ends up being political, I don't see a use for it. Driver and then a union also said that driver groups think that if they join a union, they can no longer be a leader. They will not accept our guidance. They only ask for help. So I think the timing of elections also did not help with this growing distrust between between the actors in the labor activist network. Just two more key findings. One is that informality creates a vacuum. It creates this sort of space, undefined space that allows actors to claim legitimacy. It also begs the question, right? So when you have driver groups making statements or asking for meetings with the government and platforms, whose voice are we actually hearing? Well, I think it's just very telling that even government and platform company executives are aware of that, and even the drivers themselves. Here you can see that a former platform company executive told me that, certain groups that were sometimes even introduced to us and promoted to us as the quote unquote sort of the proper voice of drivers were in fact of questionable origin. And of course, this is easily checked. You can check whether they're a driver or not by checking on your platform. And according to this executive, sometimes you don't even know where they came from. You don't have their data and you don't know who they are. Of course, there is also a possibility that due to fears of termination, they might be, giving a different persona or, a different contact information. We don't know, but what we know is that this space, this undefined space, um, delegitimizes worker struggle because their legitimacy is just being questioned. Right? There are, well, I believe there are good, honest worker struggle, but because of this undefined space, it delegitimizes their position. Because as you can see here, one government representative said that no, there are thousands of these groups in Indonesia, and every single one of them view themselves as representative of the other groups. We can't see everyone as being right. So not only are workers, informal workers, less well represented politically, they're also being doubted, and their legitimacy is being questioned because of this undefined space where nobody is really sure what is legitimate collective representation in the informal sector. I think I just also want to highlight about the partnership system between platforms and drivers. I think it ties in with informality in the way that it gives unclear boundaries, rights, and obligations for both the companies and the workers themselves and the drivers themselves. What are their rights? What are their obligations? It's just unclear because they're not defined, right? And one union representative who is helping out driver groups, assisting driver groups in demanding their rights and protesting, have said that, oh, it doesn't matter how big these driver groups are because the platform company still doesn't consider them as employees. Until now, the drivers and I haven't been able to meet the platform company management at their office. We only meet them at seminars. So the only space where they can have this discussion about the partnership and the demands are only at seminars because by law, the platforms are not obliged to grant them a meeting or an audience. And this brings me to the conclusion. Thanks for bearing with me so far. Some conclusions that I would draw from this presentation is that studies on labor organization, mobilization efforts within the informal sector, why does it even matter? Why are we even here, right? I think this is important because the informal sector is such a big part of the economy, such a big part of the social, economic, and political life in Indonesia because a lot of things are left unregulated, undefined. And to understand voices, forms of agency, we need to understand these dynamics that shape the relationship within the informal sector. Second, as we can see, which answers one of my research questions, is that the nature of collective action has evolved. It's no longer a one-time action. Let's go down and protest on the streets, but it's an ongoing process now where the driver groups engage not only the government, but also other stakeholders such as NGOs, unions, I think some driver groups have relationship with the platforms and also the public, which I think it's another area of research that would be fascinating to be investigated. Next, there should also be an agreement from all sides on how to best define legitimacy of collective representation in the context of informality and platform work. Why does this matter? Well, informality is so big in Indonesia. Platform work is a growing business, as you can see. Competition is rampant. It's such a good business. And platform work now is not just ride sharing, it's also domestic work, it's also um, home services, all sorts of things. So it's a business that will just continue to grow. And we need to come up with an agreement from all parties on how to best um, enable workers or these so-called partners to represent themselves. Uh, Also, I think boundaries of what a partnership within platform work are not well defined. This needs to be defined just so everyone is aware of what their rights are, what their obligations are. Uh, but I think it's also not fair to say that because you drive for this platform, all platform workers are employees, right? It's also not fair to say so, because when you say platform work, it does not limit platform work to one type of app or one type of occupation. There are many types of platform work, from ride sharing to domestic work to freelancing websites. For graphic designers, that is also platform work. And work is experienced in different ways across the different platforms. So there is also a need for regulators to categorize the different types of informal work that is facilitated by platforms and the rights and obligations that the stakeholders in that business has towards each other. And finally, I think this ties in with how quickly Uber departed from Indonesia, and also the recent closure of Go Life, which is a subsidiary of a part of Gojek that handles cleaning services and massage services. No, the ease with which apps can just close down and it is jarring, right? Because apps can close down that fast, but there are workers who depend their full livelihoods on these apps. So I think to sum this up, we need to have a better understanding of the role of platform work, their place and their future in Indonesia to best regulate or even just coordinate and organize this sector. Thank you so much for having me. That's all. And I would be happy to discuss further and welcome your feedback and insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for the fruitful presentation. And we already got some questions from our friends at CSIS. Mas Andrew and Wafa, would you like to ask the question yourselves, or do you want me to read your questions? Mas Andrew and Wafa, do you want to ask the question? Okay, Mas Andrew can go first. And then we have Wafa and also Pak Yosef from Department of Economics.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you for your presentation. It's been a pleasure hearing about your findings. And I think I would have to congratulate you for having completed the good research here. But I just wonder in terms of methodology, you've been using various methods, including digital ethnography and so on and so forth. My question is, in the early period of designing and probably later in actually doing your field research, do you ever think that maybe it's going to be instrumental for you to employ a direct observation in terms of ethnography in Ojek Pangkalan? Because I think from your presentation there are some negotiations that probably take place, discussion that probably took place not in the digital platform, but probably in Ojek Pangkalan. Do you think that this would make any difference to your research in terms of understanding the way this kind of grouping dynamics occur at the
Mhm.
grassroots level? That would be my first. I have another question, but later lah. Okay.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for your comments and your question. And yes, actually, when I first designed my research, I did want to do an ethnographic observation in Pangkalan and also during the protest. But unfortunately, I had to submit an ethics review for my PhD research fieldwork, and that was just shut down because I think one, it's taking into account the time that I'll be spending for field work. I
Yes.
think just incorporating various methods is ambitious in itself in terms of time, the time that you consume, and also the time spent on the road. But also, I think we didn't discuss this too much during the presentation, but also it's gendered public spaces, right?
That's
Um, because the online motorcycle taxi industry is a overwhelmingly male-dominated
brood
um,
male community.
yeah, work. I think one concern was that I'm not sure if they would be comfortable
Yeah, that's right.
having a female researcher there, and second of all, that also raised some concerns at my university. So that's why I had to mostly do digital ethnography and depend on interviews
Okay.
for these input.
Just a small note about this, because I think having encountering them every day, after taking off from train, and then right, actually ojek from station to office, I
Mhm,
sort of understand the way they think. In Indonesia, I think there are some endemic culture of premanism.
mhm,
And then it used to be ojek driver, but one of the most concern coming from citizens of Indonesia about ojol is they are once promised to be less crowded, and then they would tend to stay at home to wait for order and so on and so forth. But
yeah,
they eventually make this kind of pangkalan everywhere, which is a bit annoying for some people. And then I think there are some logic of I don't know, from your presentation there are some a bit logic of consequences, and then the logic of appropriateness. But I think there are some a mix between logic of insecurity and logic
mhm,
of connectivity that mix this energy towards the ability to organize themselves. And I remember the early period where when Gojek this kind of platform arise, we have a problem of what they call, we have a problem of begal,
mhm,
which motor driver are facing the danger of being stolen and being robbed away, and sometimes life endangering. And after that, they also have problem with angkot drivers, right?
yeah,
And they compete against each other. Sometimes it ended in violent manners. So I think the way this kind of logic or logic of insecurity combined with logic connectivity somewhat reverberate the tendency for us in a mob community to become more premanist, which is already endemic in Indonesian culture. That's all. Thank you.
thank you so much. I think those are really valuable comments and definitely something that I'll be looking to kind of integrate in the finding. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Andrew, for the questions. And we also have questions from Wafa. Do you want to ask the question yourself, or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, I can read it. Ninira, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Um, Joanna, thank you for your topic. Honestly, I mean, it's a very important topic, and I think not a lot of people pay attention to these folks that we see every day. Um, the questions written in the chats is more of my own personal curiosity. But the formal question would be: do you also see, first of all, do you also see the source or the drivers of solidarity between these workers,
Mhm,
the drivers of the mobilizations? between these informal workers. And what if you see them, if you see these source of and drivers of mobilization, what if they were cultural in nature and attributed to more of the characteristic of the society instead of like an economic class or economic groupings, but maybe there's a form of cultural characteristic to it. I list like the budaya gang, paguyuban, keforuman, the punks that we see every day, like these objects, they group into Tanah Abang, punk community society, Chideng, wolf groups. These are the type of things that we see if we ride these Gojek drivers. We see it in their jackets and everything, right? So I would just that's just my first question. So the drivers of solidarity, and do you also see it that way? Second of all, from my discussion with Dandi this morning about this particular presentation, my question would be to what extent, as we see in the Gojek system, we know that they employ kemitraan, right? So in these systems, they treat the drivers as equals. And so for me, it exposes their vulnerabilities. So the companies who's usually their employers, if it's a normal company, they would take more responsibilities to their employees. But because of this kemitraan system, and they treat them as sort of equals, I think we can also see that in terms of when they protest, when they mobilize, they're also left exposed as powerless as just people, right? And so do you see that the system has made a company like Gojek less accountable and less driven to compromise with the labor's protests? That's that's the second question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wafa. I think these are really great questions. To answer the first one, what are the source for driver solidarity and mobilization? Yeah, I think, and especially for solidarity, there are a few things that I noticed that comes up in my interviews. The first is, I think, the word family has been repeated over and over in the different interviews with drivers that I've done. So they see this community groups as family, as a place where they belong, as friends, as new friends. They said they're happy to be a driver because it just opens up, a whole new world of friendship to them. Also, there's the sense of kind of quote unquote, we're on our own. Like as partners, I think it ties into your second part. They feel quite vulnerable, especially when driving is quite a risky job, right? Because you could get into accidents or you could have like just scuffles with people on the road. And if anything happens to the driver or if they get into trouble on the road, the platforms are not responsible per se because they're not employees. So I think there's a sense of shared misery in a way, a shared sense of injustice that there is this target, which is the platforms that are causing this unfair treatment and just really bad working conditions according to them. Yeah, and also I think that is why they set up divisions like URC, the Unit Reaksi Cepat, which helps drivers who get into accidents or get into trouble in their areas. They just help these drivers if they come across them, or even helping out just the civil society. I think that's one reason why these kinds of divisions came into being. Whether it's cultural in nature, I think there's definitely that sense of looking out for each other. Begal is a big problem for some of these drivers, especially those who drive late at night, and having like at least like a shared WhatsApp group with hundreds of different people. They could just share their location on the WhatsApp group, and there will always be people monitoring them. So there's this sense of friendship, communal, and We're in this together. There's a shared sense of danger, shared sense of misery. Yeah, and your second question is, to what extent are mobilizations effective and has been to the benefit for, so your second question is, has this partnership system made the company less accountable and less driven to compromise with labor protests? Okay, yeah, I mean, definitely. Gojek's employees are not the drivers, right? Like by law, it's the people who work in the office. The drivers are quote unquote partners. By legislation, you're not obliged to entertain requests or respond to requests. I think that is to the company's discretion, but by law, to my knowledge, they are not obliged to do anything about it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Wafa, do you have any more questions, or is that all?
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the audio. Yes. Yeah. No, I was just wondering if you will sort of integrate this assessments to your research. Do you also see like this nature of or just simply like the bulk of the research, where will they go? I think that's my the basis of my questions, the first one and the second one. Will you also go to seeing solidarity for the first one, and then for the second one, will you also go to seeing this relationship between the company and the laborers? So that was just the general comments. So I mean, it's up to you. Of course, it's your research, right? I was just asking of the direction of the thesis. Will you also integrate them? And I think for now, I think you did present me with your current opinions of these statements, and I share your opinions definitely. But of course, for the future or for the finishing of your research, of course, it's up to you to whether maybe these are maybe too wide or too out of the topic, or maybe it's not entirely your focus. So it's up to you, of course.
No, thank you so much. I think those questions are great and definitely made me think a bit more about what I would be focusing in the analysis stage. And I do think your first question about solidarity ties in with what Andrew mentioned earlier about shared insecurity and this mob community mentality, which I will definitely be looking further into it further after this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wafa, for the questions and the suggestions. And we have another question from Pak Yose here. Okay, Pak Yose, the floor is yours.
Okay. Ya, terima kasih Indira. Thank you, Indira. Joanna, I think that's a very interesting presentation and finding, and I have to congratulate you for a great work looking at the dynamic of the what you call it, the collective action and mobilizations of ride-hailing drivers, in Gojek and Grab. My first question is actually like it's more like it's questions, but perhaps also it's kind of like suggestions. You mentioned about two research questions in the early part of your presentation. You explained about the research questions, and there are two research questions. So basically, those two research questions try to look at the various aspects of the dynamics of collective actions among among those ride-hailing drivers. I wonder whether you're also going to put another dimension or another part of the another research question, perhaps looking at the output and the outcome of this collective action. The first one, perhaps we can you can try to look at what kind of demand, what kind of demands and what you call this the requests that those drivers want to pursue in their collective actions, and then maybe you can try to classify them into several main demands and main requests. The second one is to look at whether they so far they will be able to pursue or to push that demand, to deliver the message, and also to get the positive response. So it's about the effectiveness of those demands. So we're looking at, of course, it's a bit different than your focus at the moment. We'll look at more on the dynamic of the process, but perhaps you can also look at the output and outcome aspects of those mobilization, whether they are effective or not. That's my first questions and perhaps also suggestions. The second one is question is more about on the strategy of those workers, those drivers. We see that there are at least three actors that has a intensive interactions with the drivers. The first one is the platform itself, Gojek and Grab. They have to deal with them. The second one, perhaps also the government. The third one, and I think this is the most important, is the consumer. My perceptions or my observation so far is that drivers tend to push their demands and their aspirations only to those two first one, those two actors, the platforms and the government. While in the end, actually, it's about the relations with consumers, and it is. And I think it is quite also important for them to mobilize and to push their agenda towards the consumer. But I don't know whether, so my question is whether during your interview you can also observe that they understand about those three actors, and also whether they also have a strategy to influence the consumers. Because actually, we have seen during the PSBB time, for example, the consumers actually are the ones who who help the drivers a lot. Most of the well, this is not for public, but my one of the research that we conducted also look at that most of the drivers actually get more support from the community and from the consumers rather than instead of from the government or from the platform. Yeah, and this is actually the importance of consumer. Well, on the other hand, if they also want to increase the tariff, for example, the rate, the tariff rate, then it is the consumers who pay for the rate, and the final say is on the consumer. But whether they already have it into account or not, so perhaps it's also good things to explore. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Payose, for the comments and the feedback. I think your first point about output and outcome and how to push demand and get the best output, I think those are really interesting topics to explore. And I will definitely look more into how maybe this could be investigated from a qualitative aspect. And your second point about the three stakeholders that workers, sorry, not workers, the drivers are in constant contact with. So you mentioned platforms themselves, government, as well as the consumers. Yes, so in my interviews, the drivers have, some drivers have mentioned that, yes, they are also looking for support from the public, because I think some of them are quite aware that the public is actually the main stakeholder and what they get for their income. But I think the missing link so far is how to best go about that, and what are some of the strategies that they can do to get public support. I think one thing that was brought up was access to media. So in terms of building narrative, I think some of the drivers felt a bit they felt like they are in a position where they are unable to build their own narrative in the media and having their narrative dictated to them by other stakeholders. So I think, I think in terms of engaging consumers and the public, there are certainly rooms for improvement, and something that the drivers should be exploring as well as the movement grows. Thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you very much, Payose, for the questions and suggestions. Or do you have any more comments, Payose?
It's okay, Indira.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you,
maybe
Pa.
others will also ask questions.
Okay, Joanna, we have another question from Mbak Fitri. She would like for me to read her questions. She sent a link about the issue of, she would like to ask your comment about the issue that the usage of Gojek and Grab that are utilized to intimidate activists in Indonesia. How do you think that the data privacy can be improved for this ride-hailing super app? Because from what I have read from the link that she's shared, some activists, like, they say that their applications, their Gojek accounts are hacked or hijacked, and they received spams, calls, and also threats from whether it is the Gojek driver or other people who are using their data. So okay, that's all.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It is beyond my scope. Can I get back to you on that, Mbak Fitri and Indira? Maybe I need time to just ruminate about it.
Okay, thank you. It's a sure thing, no problem, Joanna. And we have another question from Mas Andrew. Maybe Mas Andrew can ask the question.
Okay, Indra, thank you. Joanna, it's been interesting hearing about your research, and I can't help myself but getting enthusiastic with your findings. I was trained as constructivist in international relations, so my half of training was sociological, and it brings me back to the to my old theory I use for undergraduate study, which is a theory of culture from Anne Swidler. And I think it's been interesting in the way you present your fact. The reason I ask this, because I just suspect that there are something about uniform in Indonesia, because they've been given uniform, like a jacket with a green something like that, and I think this kind of reverberates the tendency of our organizational culture to be uniform. You in Indonesia, you are educated from very beginning to use uniform in elementary school and so on and so forth. Even in an institution like CSIS, when we are going for a retreat or a teamwork party somewhere else in Bogor or in Anyer, we've been given a uniform to reinforce the tendency to identify ourselves as a part of the biggest group. And I think we cannot deny the fact that there are some competition between these informal sectors. Like for example, during the PSBB period, there are some suspicion coming from another informal workers, like for example singers, pengamen, and so on and so forth. Why they get more attention? Why Gojek Online get more attention as informal workers other than other kind of workers? Why, for example, the president even sometimes call them up in the narrative, in the speech, and I think they are more prominent because of the use of the symbols. And this is not one of the this is the only example of the symbols that has been used to reinforce the organizational culture in Indonesia. The fact that they are gaining more attention is, I think, somewhat a tendency to reinforce the uniform habits in Indonesia. That's my take. If just take a counterfactual analysis, if they are not getting the uniform, like for example in the case of taxi online, they are more likely to organize themselves. They are less likely to organize themselves in a demonstration. Even in major demonstration in Indonesia, sometimes they use uniform, they use this kind of banners and so on and so forth to organize themselves. And I think this sort of reflect our tendency or our bigger organizational culture in Indonesia. So we still are using the old ethos. I don't know, that's back to which era, but I think this is kind of endemic in Indonesian culture, and somehow it also describes the bigger picture of the fragmented nature of the labor markets or labor organization in Indonesia. That's my take. Thank you. I would like to discuss more.
Yes, definitely. I think it's just very exciting that you talk about symbols and uniforms. It's also another area of interest of mine, although it hasn't been discussed in my research so far. But just to give you an anecdote from one of my previous interviews, I asked a driver, "How come you joined this base camp and not the other base camp?" His answer was like, "Oh, I like that logo better." So I do think uniforms matter and how we do things here. And yeah, and just another thing that a friend of mine who was an economist, he pointed out that I was sharing that drivers derive their meaning from their sense of community, um, and my friend mentioned that could it be possible that they felt like they're a part of these platforms, because of the uniform, they feel like they belong, they're a part of the company, and yet they don't have much say. So this perceived injustice is this feeling of betrayal, that I am supposed to be part of your family and wearing your uniform, but at the same time, you're cutting fares, you're changing the schemes without consulting me. Like I don't feel like I belong anymore. So yeah, so it's just very interesting that you bring up this topic of uniformity, because I do think it makes sense now in what a form.
Just a small comment, Joanna. Probably sometimes begal also afraid to rob them, because if they pick one of them in the street and they come with a group number of people flocking away the hospital or police station, probably they kind of bargain themselves, and probably they can push the begal back. Okay.
Yeah, definitely strength in numbers. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Mas Andrew, for the comments and also the questions and suggestions. Do we have any more questions from our friends at CSIS? If not, okay, then we're back to Mbak Fitri's question. Joanna, I'm sorry.
No.
Do you have any comments regarding the issue of the usage of Gojek and Grab to intimidate activists, like the privacy or the data that are used for their account?
Right. I need to take a look at the news article more closely. But if this is the issue of the activist who got a series of food deliveries through the app, is it? Because someone found out her address, and then she has to pay for the food as well. I wonder if it's. I have to take a closer look at the article to see where the data, whether the data was breached on the app side. But I think because there could be various ways to get someone's address, not just through data breach through the app. I wonder if something that needs to be put in there is to not purchase first, right? For the drivers not to purchase and just confirm first with the customer. Sorry, I need to read the article to give a more thorough answer.
No, it's okay, Joanna. Take your time.
Indira.
Yes, Pak.
Indira and Joanna. I think the question is outside of our topic today, outside of the scope of the study Joanna currently conducting. So perhaps Fitri and Joanna can have bilateral discussions later on that topic if necessary.
Okay, that would also be good. Maybe Mbak Fitri and Joanna can have further discussion about this matter later on. Do we have any more questions from our friends?
Indira, I have.
Okay, yes,
question.
Sandy, feel free to ask your questions.
Yeah. So it's just a simple question. How do you think the government's role in this sort of beef between the informal workers and also the platform? How the performance of our government right now? I think you already mentioned several demonstrations, and then also laws regarding the platform, and of course the tariff. How do you conclude the role of the government and then the effectiveness of the government?
Thank you, Mas Dandy, for the question. Yeah, so after the series of mobilizations, there have been efforts from the government to engage driver groups more formally, be it by setting up Team 10, which is a group of 10, I think it ended up being 12, 10, no, 10 drivers who represented driver groups in negotiating their terms and conditions for the regulation in 2019. So, there are efforts. I think we have to acknowledge that there are efforts by the government to engage them formally, to give them a seat at the negotiating table. But in terms of effectiveness, whether or not all their demands or most of them become a reality, I think that's a topic for another research. I think that ties in with what Pak Yose suggested earlier, which is to evaluate the output and outcome, whether these demands have been met. So there are efforts, I think, and the government does give space for them. And I think we go back to the role of the government, right, which is as a policymaker and as a regulator. And I think going forward in terms of just issues that we talked about earlier, clarifying the extent of partnerships, what the rights and obligations of the parties are, effective collective representation and legitimacy in the informal sector. I think these are some of the things that the government should be considering to avoid things like actors just taking advantage of the informality and delegitimizing honest worker struggle.
I just want to give a sort of like a suggestion regarding the study. Is it will be more additional information regarding maybe you can use some case of a study So you can choose, for example, an issue of tariff, or probably safety regulation. So you can have a more I don't know, like a comprehensive literature reviews, and also a more focus on the problem, and that you can actually identify the stakeholders, probably like Pak Yose mentioned. Also, you can actually include the consumer if you're talking about tariffs and safety, right? So yeah, that's my comment.
Thank you so much, Mas Dandi, and I'll definitely look into the suggestion.
Thank you very much, Danny, for the questions. Okay, friends, do we have any more questions? If we do not have any more questions, I think that would be all today. Thank you for the very insightful presentation, Joanna, and also thank you to our friends from CSIS and also our friends joining us from YouTube. Thank you for joining us on today's seminar stuff, and we hope to see you again in our next seminar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.